I once met with a wedding couple. One partner was Jewish, one partner was not. That's not unusual. But in this case, the Jewish partner was herself the product of an intercultural marriage. Her mother had actually converted to Judaism when that daughter was, I think, in her teens. She herself had attended a Jewish religious education at a Reform synagogue from kindergarten all the way through high school and had stayed post bat mitzvah. She then in college went to a Hillel to connect with Jewish community on the college campus. But because she was somewhat tall and blonde, someone began interrogating her about her parentage. And when they found out that her mother had not converted before she was born, they were very willing to be the ethnic bouncer and tell her, "You're not really Jewish. You don't belong." I apologized to her because here was someone who wanted to be Jewish, who was raised Jewish, who was connected to Jewish community, who was voluntarily seeking out Jewish community while in college when nobody was making her do it. And here's someone else who is the self-appointed bouncer telling her, "You don't belong." Now, fortunately, things are better in the Jewish world today than they were 20 years ago, and they're certainly better than they were 40 years ago or 60 years ago for Jewish people who choose to marry someone who's not from a Jewish background, or for their children or their families. And I say choose to marry someone from a not Jewish background, but it's not like someone goes onto a dating app and says, "I want to find a non-Jewish person to marry." What happens is they go out in the world and they meet people. And they find someone who's smart and interesting and funny and nice and kind and generous, and they fall in love and they want to get married. So they're not marrying a non-Jew. They're marrying John. They're marrying Ravinda. They're marrying a person who is, in their own uniqueness, someone that they've fallen in love with. Of course, the history of intermarriage is much broader than these individual encounters, yet it's also these individual encounters. And more importantly, it opens up windows into how we understand Jewish identity, Jewish community, and our role in either opening the door or slamming it shut. The goal today is to understand a bit of the history of how we got to where we are now, but also understand how we got here. So I want to share with you some statistics from a survey that was taken by the American Jewish Committee in the year 2000. And as far as I know, they've never asked these questions again because they didn't like the answers. Now, the American Jewish Committee is part of the sort of mainstream Jewish establishment. They want more conventional answers to these questions, and they always ask an annual survey about your opinion of your standard of living and your perspective on Israel. Is the current American government sufficiently pro-Israel or not, and so on. But this year, in the year 2000, they asked a series of questions about intermarriage. And the answers were very striking by how welcoming they were compared to what the Jewish establishment was at the time. So as one example, question 37 in their survey, they said, what's a greater threat to Jewish life in the United States today, intermarriage or anti-Semitism? 41% said intermarriage, 50% said anti-Semitism, 7% said both equally. That was sort of along the lines of what they expected. But then they asked these questions, 42, 43, and so on, and look at the answers. It would pain me if my child married a Gentile. Only 39% agreed, 56% disagreed. Intermarriage is inevitable in an open society. 80% agreed. The best response to intermarriage is encourage the Gentile to convert. 2/3 said no. The Jewish community has an obligation to reach out to intermarried couples. 80% said yes. Well, that's not what Jewish life was like in the year 2000. It's a bit more like that now, but it certainly wasn't that back then. Look at these questions about your attitude toward marriage between a Jew and a Gentile. I strongly disapprove, only 12%. I'm disappointed by marriage between a Jew and a Gentile, 30%. I'm neutral, 40%. A positive good, 16%. And then my favorite question, and at this time in the year 2000, no conservative rabbis, maybe a third of Reform rabbis, certainly no Orthodox rabbis, would officiate at intermarriages. And the Reform movement is still technically on the record saying they disapprove, as we'll see, some rabbinic statements on the question. But look at the results when asking, should a rabbi officiate at a mixed marriage? Rabbis should refuse under any circumstances. Only 22% said they should refuse. 16% said they should do it if there's no Gentile clergyman. But 57%, well over half, said that rabbis should officiate at an intermarriage even if a Gentile clergyman is involved in the ceremony. Now, we know that the AJC didn't want to see these numbers, in part because of the way it appears on the AJC website. Look what they did with the information here. Tell me if you agree. Agree, disagree, not sure. A, it would pain me if my child married a Gentile, 3956-4. B, intermarriage is inevitable in open society, 1812. It's almost impossible to decipher the information. I had to break it out into a chart so you could see it. They didn't want people to be able to find the information easily or to be able to present it easily. I'll also note that for the next decade and a half after this, while I was still checking, they never asked these questions again. Imagine what the answers to these questions would be today in 2024. My guess is they would be even more open, even more welcoming, even more affirmative. And they certainly wouldn't list intermarriage as great a threat to Jewish life in the US as anti-Semitism. Now, these answers were not a shock to those of us who have been out there performing these weddings and welcoming these families into Jewish communities. We know that most lay Jews are more accepting than the Jewish establishment because they have kids or nephews or brothers or sisters, friends, relatives who have married non-Jewish people, who are wonderful people, who have raised Jewish children in those families, and they see that the sky is not falling if we don't act like it is. And that positive responses, like welcoming, outreaching to intermarried couples, will do much better than it would pain me if my child married someone not Jewish. I strongly disapprove. That's not going to stop it, but it will turn the people away. Now, Jewish history shows that intermarriage is not just a new phenomenon. It goes back to the earliest records we have and even legends we have about Jewish life. In the Hebrew Bible, the first child of an intercultural or interethnic partnership is actually the first child of the first Jew, according to the legends, Abraham. You may recall Abraham is married to Sarah, but Sarah has a servant named Hagar, which literally means the resident alien, the stranger. And Sarah is unable to have children, so she asks Abraham to have a child with her handmaid, Hagar, which he does. And that child is named Ishmael. Hagar and Ishmael in the end are expelled from the Abraham household. Ishmael becomes the father of people today claim the Arab peoples. That's why they claim Ismail as one of their ancestors. But it's very obvious from the very beginning that Jews are able and willing to have children with people who aren't Jewish. We also see that Abraham's grandson, Esau, marries a Canaanite wife. It's not approved of, it's disapproved of in the text. This also happens to Abraham's great-grandson, Judah. In Genesis chapter 38, he marries the daughter of a Canaanite. Even Judah's brother Joseph, Joseph, the Technicolor Dreamcoat, he marries someone not Jewish because when he is in Egypt, it says in Genesis chapter 41, Pharaoh gave Joseph an Egyptian name of Zaphnath Paneah and gave him Asnat, the daughter of Potipharah, the priest of On, to be his wife. So Joseph marries the daughter of an Egyptian priest. No comment in the Torah text. As an aside, rabbinic commentators had a lot of problems with that. So they imagined a speculative history where Joseph's sister Dinah gave birth to a daughter, and then that daughter was adopted by an Egyptian family, but she wore an amulet that let Joseph know that she was actually Jewish. And that's how he was able to marry a Jewish person, even in the midst of Egypt. But it's like a soap opera, where families are lost and reconnected, and all of a sudden all the dots connect. It's not what the original story. The original story accepted that Joseph was able to marry this non-Jewish woman, and yet his children, Manasseh and Ephraim, become major tribes in the people of Israel. There's an anecdote during the Exodus story that describes this as a matter-of-fact event. The son of an Israelite woman, whose father was an Egyptian, went out among the children of Israel, and the son of the Israelite woman and a man of Israel strove together in the camp. The son of the Israelite woman blasphemed the name and cursed, and they brought him to Moses, saying, what should be done? Well, in this case, he's put to death. Not a happy ending. However, notice that the son of an Israelite woman is among the Israelites that are leaving Egypt. It is noted who his father is, so it's not like they're ignoring the fact of his parentage, but they certainly have allowed him to be part of the community. Moses marries a Cushite woman, it says in Numbers chapter 12, which provokes Moses and Aaron to speak against them, but the fact that he married her is there, and on and on. You've got Esther in the book of Esther marrying the Persian king, and he doesn't even know she's Jewish. So it's not like he converted before they got married. Or you have the story of Ruth, which is often read in the early summer during the holiday of Shavuot. Ruth is from Moab, from one of the peoples that are the implacable enemies of the Israelites, and yet she is allowed to join the Jewish people with her famous declaration after her husband has died, and her mother-in-law, Naomi, tells her, go back to your people, go back to your gods. And Ruth says famously, do not entreat me to leave you or keep me from following you, for wherever you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, will I die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do to me so, and more also, if even death parts me from you. So it's a declaration of her loyalty to both the Jewish God and to the Jewish people and to her family. And yet, throughout the rest of the book of Ruth, Ruth is continually referred to as the Moabitess, the Moaviah. So yes, she converts, maybe, but she's still recognized as the foreigner who's welcome here. They're not forgetting her conversion or pre-conversion origins. Now, we should remember that the rabbinic interpreters of the Bible, we don't just read the Bible, we're always interpreting it through the translation, through our cultural context, and the rabbis who provided a cultural context for these biblical stories assumed that their standards of who was a Jew and what counts as conversion and how mandatory conversion was and what kind of religious authorities were in place were always the same. They projected their approach backwards. So, of course, when Ruth said this, that was just her opening declaration. And then she went to her local rabbi and went to the mikveh ritual bath and was immersed. The assumption is that it's always been the way we do it now. So they would imagine that son of an Israelite woman whose father was an Egyptian, the father probably converted in some way. If they wanted a rabbi to do the wedding, of course, and they would have to do that. But that's, again, projecting their rabbinic values. One example is the word ger. I mentioned Hagar was the stranger, the resident alien. The word ger in the Hebrew Bible often means, again, stranger, resident alien. But in rabbinic commentary and rabbinic interpretation, more often than not, they translate the word ger as convert. So resident alien really means the outsider who's joined our community. And it's always this double identity of what in the book of Ezra is called the holy seed. It's religious and it's ethnic. It's like Ruth says, your people will be my people, your God will be my God. It's both an ethnic and a religious identification. So even when the Bible text seems to be patrilineal, where Joseph can marry an Egyptian priestess, the rabbis assume it must have been matrilineal. He must have taken that priestess to a visiting Chabad rabbi who converted her, and that's the assumption. The second thing we have to qualify this opening with is that the Bible is not necessarily history. This is written at a later time and projecting these stories back into the ancestral past of the Hebrew people. So it reflects when it was written, but not necessarily what actually happened in that time period. Lot, who is Abraham's nephew, is described as having had incestuous sex with his daughters after Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed, and the children produced by that sex with his daughters are the Ammonites and the Moabites. Remember the Moabites? Ruth's people, how terrible they are? According to that story, well, she's still welcomed as a convert later. But that's not where the Moabites and Ammonites really came from. They didn't come from the incestuous relationship of Lot with his daughters. That's a story that later generations told about their neighbors, those bastards over there. More importantly, the rules prohibiting intermarriage or the stories condemning it make sense only if it's actually happening. You see, you don't ban things that nobody does. So if there are stories that make intermarriage look bad, it means intermarriage is happening. Even the story in Leviticus that we just saw in Leviticus 24, which has a bad ending, and the child of this Israelite woman marrying an Egyptian man is a no-goodnik and gets killed for blasphemy. Nevertheless, that kind of a partnership is conceivable and is described as having happened. There are plenty of biblical examples that demonstrate it was a common phenomenon. Under the reign of King David, there's a description of Uriah the Hittite, whose name is Uriah the Hittite, not Uriah the ex-Hittite who converted. Uriah the Hittite marries a woman named Bathsheba, who is then taken by King David to be his wife and becomes the mother of Solomon, who becomes the third king of the United Monarchy after David dies. Now, in Deuteronomy, we have a prohibition. Again, they're prohibiting something that could have happened. When your God brings you into the land you possess and cast out many nations before you, you strike them, you completely destroy them. And here in the underlined text in Deuteronomy 7, and you shall not make marriages with them. Your daughter you shall not give to his son, nor shall his daughter will you take to your son. For they will turn away your son from following me, that they may serve other gods. Now, you'll notice, by the way, this is a two-way prohibition. Don't give your daughters away, don't give your sons away. But it doesn't seem to have a clear statement that even if your daughter marries the foreigner's son, your daughter's kids are still going to be Jewish because the mother defines who's Jewish. That's not there. It's not clearly delineating matrilineal or patrilineal descent. Most of the Bible generally seems to have been patrilineal, that is, the father defined whether you were part of the Hebrew people. There are plenty of stories of Jewish men marrying non-Jewish women in the stories, and they are accepted as part of the core line of the Hebrew people. The changing point seems to have been around 500 BCE, which is the time where Ezra the priest is returning. This is near the end of the writing of the Hebrew Bible. Ezra the priest returns with a fully written Torah scroll, which includes this passage from Deuteronomy, and he decides he needs to clean up the people who are in the land. He praised and confessed and prayed and confessed and wept and cast himself down before the house of God. One of the sons of Elam answered to Ezra, "We have trespassed against our God and taken alien wives from the people of the land. Now let us make a covenant with our God to put away all these women and those born of them, and let it be done according to the Torah. So send away their foreign-born wives and the foreign-born wives' children, who are not seen at this point as part of the line of Israel." Ezra arose, they swore to do this, and at the end of this passage, Ezra the priest stood up and said, "You have transgressed and taken foreign wives to increase the guilt of Israel. Make confession to the Lord God of your fathers, do his will, and separate yourself from the people of the land and from the foreign wives." So now we have a clear separation of Israelites from the surrounding peoples, or at least a desire to do so, and specifically a rejection of marrying foreign wives and keeping them in the prohibited camp. Now, rabbinic law, which begins to develop in the last couple centuries BCE and the first couple centuries of the Common Era, very clearly rejects intermarriage and also begins to fully shift to this matrilineal approach that Ezra inaugurates. So here, for example, is in the early collection of rabbinic law called the Mishnah that focuses on kiddushin, which is sanctification in the context of marriage. So this passage says, wherever there is betrothal and no sin, the child goes after the male. What case is this? This is for a priestly woman or an ordinary Jewish woman who married a priest, a Levite, or an ordinary Jew. So you follow the male identity for which tribe you're in. Are you a priest, a Kohen? Are you a Leviah, a Levite? Or you're just an ordinary person? But if the women marry someone up in station, an ordinary Jewish woman who marries a priest, and there's no sin involved in that, then you follow the higher identity of the father. However, if there's betrothal and there is a sin, the child goes after the one that's flawed. So if a widow marries the high priest, which you're not allowed to do, and all sorts of other cases like that. Any woman for whom there is no betrothal to the husband, but there is betrothal to others, the child is a mamzer, that's a bastard with impure pedigree. This is one who cohabits with any one of the forbidden relations mentioned in the Torah. So now, any woman for whom there is no betrothal, either to him, the father, or to others, the child is like her. What case is this? The child of a non-Jewish maidservant or a non-Jewish woman. The implication here is that a betrothal between a Jewish man and a non-Jewish woman is inconceivable. So, the identity of the child follows the non-Jewish woman. In other words, the mother defines who's Jewish and the father cannot. It's a rare case of father disability in rabbinic Judaism where Jewish men on their own cannot make Jewish children because the child follows the status of a Jewish woman because the non-Jewish woman because they're not allowed to get married under rabbinic law. No engagement and no marriage. Well, what they then have to do, of course, is look back at Deuteronomy, because Deuteronomy went both ways, remember? Don't give your daughter to their son, don't give it's your daughter, do not give to his son, nor his daughter take for your son. Seems to go both ways. Well, the way the rabbis interpret it is they actually change it. So they understand it as your daughter do not give to the non-Jewish son, his daughter do not take to your son, for they will turn away. And the last son here they put as your grandson. Because if your daughter is given to his son, then that child will be the one that's turned away to serve other gods. It's a very convoluted interpretation that I don't really buy, to be honest. But it's an attempt to project back this concept of a matrilineal descent. Again, understanding the reality that this still continues to happen. You know, if you had a merchant who traveled a long distance and decided to settle down in India or in Central Asia as part of the Silk Road trade, they often would marry local women under some variety of conversion, maybe, but maybe not. So the rabbis are opposed to this kind of intermarriage, and yet they still have to deal with case after case of it happening. When you study Jewish genetics, you find that actually Jews tend to match the maternal gene line of the native population in those areas. That's how Jews in India look different from Jews in Yemen, and Jews in Yemen look different from Jews in Poland, and Jews in Poland look different from Jews in North Africa. They look different because they marry local women. That the Y-linked genes, which are from the male line only, tend to follow a more typical Jewish pattern. But the mitochondrial DNA, which comes only from the mother and the ovum, that tends to match the general population, reflecting this history that Jews were marrying the non-Jewish population. That's why they look so different in different parts of the world. It's not the food, and it's not the air and the climate. Now, during the medieval period, conversion was mostly illegal, or certainly frowned upon, under both Christianity and Islam. So there isn't a lot of conversion there. And if a Jew were to marry a non-Jew, in many cases that meant leaving Judaism, both from the Christian and Islamic perspective and from the Jewish perspective. It really only is with the arrival of a secular government and civil marriage that you begin to get the possibility that someone could intermarry and stay Jewish. So in 1806, Napoleon assembled a collection of Jewish notables, both rabbis and lay leaders. And one of the questions he asked them as he was investigating how French are these Jews really going to be, he said, can a Jewess marry a Christian and a Jew a Christian woman, or does the law only allow the Jews to marry among themselves? Well, their answer is fascinating, because they start out by saying, the law does not say that a Jewess cannot marry a Christian, nor a Jew a Christian woman, nor does it state that the Jews can only marry among themselves. What? What about that whole long history of not accepting the child of a Jewish woman, of a non-Jewish woman who's married to a Jewish man, all the requirements for conversion, the treatment of the ger, the stranger, as a convert, but not as an outside stranger? I mean, there's all these rules they built up over the centuries, and then they claim the only marriages forbidden are the 7 Canaanite nations with Ammon and Moab and the Egyptians. The prohibition is absolutely concerning them, but at this point, the modern nations are not to be considered as such. And accordingly, there have been, they say, at several periods, intermarriages between Jews and Christians in France, Spain, and Germany. They were sometimes tolerated and sometimes forbidden by the laws of the sovereigns, but they did happen. There's an admission here. Unions of this kind are still found in France, but they admit, we cannot deny the opinion of the rabbis is against these marriages. That's about as soft as they can put it. The opinion of the rabbis is against these marriages, because they cannot accept the ceremonies called kiddushim, just like we saw in the Mishnah, for these partnerships. Therefore, the marriages are not religiously valid unless these ceremonies are performed. Notice at the end of that paragraph, the last line, if they did some kind of marriage without those rituals, they would be considered as married civilly but not religiously. This is brand new. The idea that you can be married civilly by some kind of legal entity that's not a church, synagogue, mosque, or other kind of religious institution, that's the innovation of the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, this whole new idea of secular citizenship. So maybe someone from a Jewish background could marry someone from a Christian background at City Hall, and to hell with the religious authorities. And what they do in their home is going to be what they choose to do. So that's a brand new concept. They summarize in the last paragraph, such is the opinion of the rabbis, members of this assembly. In general, they would be no more inclined to bless the union of a Jewess with a Christian, or a Jew with a Christian woman, then Catholic priests themselves would be disposed to say, it's not just us, we Jews are not the only ones that are upset about these partnerships. The Catholic priests wouldn't be so thrilled either. But the rabbis acknowledge that a Jew who marries a Christian woman does not cease to be considered a Jew by his brothers, any more than if he'd married a Jewess civilly and not religiously. So now, the Jew who marries a Christian woman is still a Jew. And there's even the possibility that they could get married to a Jewish woman without religious law at all. That also was inconceivable before modern times. Now, even though the Enlightenment democratic society world suggests that intermarriage would be more possible with civil marriage, with city hall options and so on, and the lack of establishment of a national synagogue or a chief rabbi in the United States and in other more democratic countries. Nevertheless, the rate of intermarriages were relatively low until after World War II. You had certain places where they did go up, or in certain communities they did. So for the early Sephardic Jews who helped to found the American colonies, they were a very small percentage, but they were active in that work. Many of them had intermarried by the late 19th century, and there weren't very many of those families left. Time is sort of the dissolving factor for those strong ethnic bonds. So here's an example of the frequency of outmarriages in the 1930s, the 1980s, and the 2000s, as estimated by a Jewish demographer named Sergio della Pergola, who works at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. So you'll notice that the column on the left is what percent of the Jews were marrying non-Jews. So in the 1930s, In most countries, very few Jews married the outside population. In Poland, in Lithuania, in Iran, in Ethiopia, it was under 1%. It was only as high as 5% in the US, the UK, Egypt, Libya. It was up to 15% in countries like France, Czechoslovakia, the USSR, where Jews were more emancipated, more integrated with the surrounding culture. In Germany, notice, in the 1930s, the intermarriage rate was as high as 15 to 25%. In Weimar Germany, Jews were very free, and they were more and more integrated with the surrounding culture, and they married non-Jewish people. And the higher rates were in Australia, New Zealand, Scandinavia, where you had very small Jewish populations, and if they want to get married, they look around them, and that's what they have to choose from. But you'll notice that the numbers are relatively small in most parts of the Jewish world. Now, in the 1980s, the only country where the intermarriage rate is still thought to be 1% or less in that period is Israel, because the non-Jewish population are hostile Palestinians or the surrounding Arab countries, or people that Israelis happen to meet when they're outside of the country, which they didn't do as much in the 80s as they do these days. So the numbers are very low. But in North Africa and in Asia in the 1980s, we have to remember there weren't as many Jews there anymore. They had mostly left and moved to Europe, to America, or to Israel proper. In South Africa, the numbers are in the 15 to 25% range. But in Canada, Australia, the United Kingdom, Brazil, Latin America, those numbers are getting up in the 25 to 30% range. It's getting in the 45% range in Western Europe and in Italy, in Argentina. The United States is in the 45 to 55% range. And it's even higher in West Germany, Eastern Europe, aside from the USSR, and Scandinavia. Again, very small Jewish populations, more likely to marry the surrounding peoples. And by the 2000s, you even have to break up Israel proper and the West Bank settlements because the behavior is somewhat different. And you notice that those high numbers before continue to be high. Some of them get even higher. So the reality is that in the 20th century, intermarriage rates went up. And this is true as well from national Jewish population surveys that showed when you ask people, did you marry a non-Jewish partner? Before 1970, only 13% of American Jews were married. If they were married before 1970, 13% were married to a non-Jewish partner, where that number went up to 28% if you were married in the 70s, 38% in the first half of the 80s, 43%, second half of the 80s, up close to 50% by the end of the 1990s. And that number among non-Orthodox Jews today is even higher, in the 60s or 70% of marriages involving a Jewish person that are to a non-Jewish partner. So intermarriage has become much the norm in the American Jewish setting. And there's a lot of reasons why this is the case. First, and perhaps the most important, is secularization. You know, as you're not following Jewish dietary laws and you're not as suspicious of the surrounding Jewish population, you have less of a sense of chosenness that God wants you to be a separate people. You begin to integrate with the surrounding culture, and religion is no longer a scruple to doing that. And if the non-Jewish population is secularizing too, any number of surveys have shown the rise of what they call the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, people who are not particularly religious. Well, secularized Jews and secularized Christians actually agree on how the world works and values and all kinds of important issues, including politics in many cases. And so there's just less of a barrier to marrying. And even their parents don't take their religion that seriously, such that they're going to excommunicate them if something happens. Also, by the 21st century, Jews are very acculturated in America. There are fewer Jews as a proportion of the Jewish population who are immigrants. There are certainly Jews coming from other countries, Israel, former Soviet Union, that have the immigrant experience. But most American Jews do not have an immigrant even as a grandparent, let alone as a great-grandparent. And so the more they're integrated into American culture, they're fluent in the language, they're fluent in the cultural vocabulary, the cultural references, and so on, they're less in need of maintaining only their own community's identity. They are open to integrating with the surrounding peoples. And that includes where they live, what schools they go to, their higher professional education, where they work. You know, Jews aren't only working in Jewish run hospitals or law firms or accounting firms anymore. They can integrate with anybody, and That means they can have coworkers with whom they fall in love and choose to marry. We also have to understand that even those that are religious are more ecumenical. I believe in God and I'm a good person. That's sometimes the extent of their religiousness. And so if you believe in God and you're a good person in Hebrew, and this other person believes in God as a good person in English, then even if they are an interfaith with different religious traditions, partnership, that doesn't mean their religion is a huge barrier to their participating versus someone who believes with deep passion that Jesus Christ died for our sins and was resurrected on the third day, and I have to go to church every week to take communion, versus someone who wants to keep kosher and attend synagogue in walking distance because they won't use a car on Shabbat. That's quite a gulf religiously. But if they're both living largely secularized lifestyle and have a very kind of bland liberal religion theology, the differences are not very big. And finally, we live in a world now, generally, not exclusively, not universally, but generally, of tolerance and love. We went through a whole civil rights movement, and certainly for the college-educated population, the idea of saying to someone, I won't marry you because of your ethnic identity, feels racist, problematic. If someone said to you, I won't marry you because you're Jewish, we would be offended. How dare you? So the reality today is that the Jewish community is more accepting. The non-Jewish community is more accepting of intercultural partnerships. The barriers are simply much lower, and intermarriage is inevitable in an open society. I used to tell a joke that if I tell to young people today, they don't even get it. Here's the joke. A man brings his bride-to-be home to meet his mother, and he says, Mama, I want you to meet my bride. We're very much in love. We're very excited to be getting married. She's a Native American. That's her culture and identity. And her name is Running Deer. And the mother extends a hand gravely to shake and says, I'm sitting Shiva. Now, the joke is that that's her Indian name, right? But also sitting Shiva means you're in mourning, as if your son is dead to you because he's marrying someone who's not Jewish. But that isn't the reaction for the vast majority of American Jewish parents whose child brings home a non-Jewish partner. In many cases, if the kid's over 35, they are thanking God that the kid's getting married at all. You won't be alone. I have a chance of grandkids. So the reality is that we're much more accepting today. The Orthodox world is not. Parts of the conservative movement are not. They won't allow non-Jews to be members of communities in some cases. Even in the conservative movement, the rabbis won't officiate. They won't even acknowledge them in the congregational bulletin if a grandchild is born unless the mother was Jewish. So if you have a Jewish son who has a kid with a non-Jewish partner, forget it. If you have a Jewish daughter that has a kid with a non-Jewish partner, then they might list the birth announcement in the newsletter. But the Reform movement is more accepting these days. And our movement, of course, has been accepting from the very beginning. Just to give you a couple examples, in 1973, this is a statement that the Reform movement put out about rabbinic officiation at mixed marriages. They reaffirmed their stand from 1909 that mixed marriage is contrary to the Jewish tradition and should be discouraged. And now it declares its opposition to participation by its members in any ceremony solemnizing a mixed marriage. They accept that historically its members have held diverse interpretations. And if someone has already entered into a mixed marriage, they want to educate the children of those marriages as Jews, create an opportunity for conversion, create a consistent cultivation of involvement in the Jewish community. So they want to be open and welcoming. They just don't want to get their hands dirty with doing the wedding. Now, this is, again, 1973. We're talking 50 years ago. That was the rejectionist stance. In 1982, they highlight when they are opposed to co-officiation, they refer to the most flagrant form of mixed marriage, which they publicly repudiate. However, they also, at the same time, notice that's in 73, 82. In 1983, the Reform movement came out with their very important statement that accepts that the child of a Jewish father who is raised as a Jew can be considered as Jewish. And so they accept either mother or father, as long as the child's being raised as Jewish, whatever that means, as sufficient to accept Jewish identity. The child of one parent who is Jewish is under the presumption of Jewish descent. That was a revolutionary statement. So on one hand, they're saying we won't officiate at the marriages. On the other hand, they're saying welcome the families in your community. And they're saying their kids will be accepted as Jewish. That's definitely progress, even if it's backhanded progress on the officiation front. Now, our movement, some years later, came out with an even more radical statement that said, we welcome, this is the second underlined part here, we welcome into the Jewish people all men and women who sincerely desire to share the religious experience regardless of their ancestry. It's not only a religious community if you want to be a member of the Jewish people. And so our definition in the resolution says we affirm a Jew is a person of Jewish descent, notice descent, either side, even remotely, grandparent, or any person who declares himself to be a Jew and who identifies with the history, ethical values, culture, civilization, community, and fate of the Jewish people. So any child of intermarriage, any intermarried Jew, even someone who is the non-Jewish partner of a Jewish person and who wants to feel connected to the Jewish people, we welcome them, and we don't make them jump through hoops or take a bath or do any of those ritual performances that others might require. When someone comes to me and wants me to participate in their marriage ceremony, if one partner is Jewish, I'm always there to say Mazel Tov. I don't say Oy vey, because they've asked for a Jewish presence at their wedding, just like that woman I mentioned at the beginning who went to a Hillel, who wanted to connect to being Jewish. People told her to go away, and I would tell her, welcome, thank you. Want to serve on the board? You know, the reaction is, if we push them away, they'll leave. If we welcome them in, they'll stay. And that's been shown in Jewish communities across the country that a more welcoming and open and affirming approach to intermarriage means these families will often choose a Jewish choice.
I had trouble finding a Reform rabbi to marry me with my non-Jewish wife in 1989. My children were not raised Jewish. They weren't raised any. I had no use for religion between 1964 and about 1985. But my son was able to marry a Jewish woman by a Reform rabbi, even though he said to him, "You're not Jewish, you know," because he wasn't raised Jewish.
Mm-hmm. Well, notice that he would have accepted him as Jewish if he had been raised Jewish with you as the father because of that patrilineal descent.
Right. Yeah.
But he still was willing, but the rabbi was still willing to do the wedding even without that.
Yeah. I got a genotype because I was sure that, given where my family looks, the German Jews, and we have genealogy to the late 16th century, because I was sure there'd be non-Jews in that genotype, but I turned out to be 100% Ashkenazi because I'm sure they don't look at the mitochondria genes. They only look at the male's genes. It's much more expensive to look at the mitochondria genes.
Yeah. Well, it's also, different Jewish communities had different experiences. Some Jewish communities were very self-isolated.
Right.
And where others had more sort of fuzzy edges and were more flexible in there. Yeah. Look, the prevalence of very tall blonde people in Eastern Europe did not bleed into the Jewish population. There were some, and there's the proverbial Cossack rape and whatever, but it was a much more mutually hostile and isolated community setting than you might have found in other parts in Central Asia and in India and in other far-flung diasporas.
But so many Jews migrated throughout the Rhine before Rome, and they certainly didn't bring women with them.
Maybe yes, maybe no.
Yeah.
There's a speculation that most Ashkenazi Jews descend from one of four women that were like the matriarchs that made their way into Eastern Europe and then multiplied. I'm not as current on the DNA studies,
Yeah.
But honestly, I mean, DNA is a whole other variable on the who is a Jew question,
Right.
because now it's whatever 23andMe says, and whatever their secret algorithm is for deciding what counts as Jewish DNA versus what doesn't.
Right.
It's a little bit speculative, and it's certainly nothing that any rabbi in an Orthodox context would accept as proof of Jewishness.
Right. Right.
I do remember that when the former Republican Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, tested positive, like 1% of his DNA was Jewish or whatever, there were a lot of very progressive Jews who went on social media demanding a recount, because how dare he be one of our people? And the reality is that the genetics is a mixed bag in terms of accuracy. But for some people, it's very meaningful. I mean, I do get people who contact me or who are connected to our movement more broadly, who find us because they do a DNA test and they find they're 25% or 15% Jewish, and they want to explore that part of who they are. Or sometimes, I mean, this has happened where people find out that their parent was Jewish and never told them.
Right.
This
Like
famously
Albright.
happened to a Senate candidate in Virginia, who was the son of a former Washington Redskins, pardon the name, football coach. His mother was actually a North African Jew, but was a Holocaust survivor and had been traumatized by it. So she never told him that she was Jewish. So he didn't even know until he was a Senate candidate, and he used some racial slur for somebody that is typical of Jews in North Africa to use
Right.
that. And people began investigating his background, and it came out that he was Jewish. And initially, he had a terrible reaction to it, where he said, "Yeah, well, yeah, she was Jewish, but don't cast aspersions on people, and she makes really good pork chops," because he wanted to, affirm his good old boy bona fides for running for Senate in Virginia. But he later on connected with his Jewish heritage more in a much more positive way. And it really has been sort of an eye-opening experience for him in terms of who he is. So that rediscovery process is also part of the history of intermarriage.
And
I
Madeleine Albright didn't know she was Jewish. Her
Right.
parents were Jewish till she was an adult.
Yeah, that's another one. And to mention another political figure from the 90s, and then Rami, I'll get to you. You may remember there was a senator from Maine and a secretary of defense named William Cohen.
Yes.
Last name Cohen.
Yeah.
His father was Jewish, his mother was not. And he actually studied to have a bar mitzvah.
Hmm.
And shortly before the bar mitzvah, the rabbi told him, "You have to go through a conversion. You're not really Jewish because it's just your father," even with the name Cohen. And so little Bill Cohen said, "Forget it."
Hmm.
And he didn't have the bar mitzvah. He signed out of being Jewish. He, I think, identified as Unitarian or something else. And we lost him, for our team, because we were short-sighted or parochial or pedantic. And the fact that he had studied for a bar mitzvah with the last name Cohen wasn't enough.
Right.
And we had to add a hoop that he had to jump through, which he refused to jump through. Sorry, Rami, you were going to jump in.
That's okay. I just going back to the survey that you spoke about at the beginning. One data point stuck out to me, and it said that Jewish community has the obligation to urge Jews to marry Jews, and it was like close to 70%, and that seemed contradiction to everything else that you were pointing to. So I'm wondering why, or how you understand that.
Part of it is the ambiguity of survey taking, where people can hold contradictory beliefs and not explode. So I remember a survey in the year 2000 during the presidential campaign where they asked people, do you have a problem with Joe Lieberman, the vice presidential candidate, being Jewish? And large numbers of people said, no, I have no problem with that. Do you have a problem with the fact he doesn't believe in Jesus? A substantial number of people had a problem with it. What did it mean that he was Jewish to them then? There's a disconnect there. So I can totally see that there'd be a proportion of people who say that it's racist to oppose intermarriage, and the Jewish community still has an obligation to encourage Jews to marry Jews. They would see those as, both positive values in a survey, even though rationally, when you're looking at them right next to each other, they seem to be in contradiction.
Yeah. Well, it does seem to be in contradiction to me.
Yeah. But, as I said, nobody has died from a logical contradiction. So they're allowed to hold that perspective. And look, the other thing is that you'll get people who would say, would I prefer my kid to marry someone Jewish?
Yeah.
Maybe yes. Would I prefer them to be married than not married? Yes. So given the choice of not married versus, holding out for someone Jewish and rejecting anybody else, most parents are not going to make that choice.
That was my parents. I married a man who was Catholic, but we got married in India in a Christian civil ceremony in Bombay at the time. And we thought we would be in India forever, but we came back. And my parents were so grateful that we came back that they didn't really care that he was not Jewish, and that he was willing to have a rabbi come to the living room of my parents' apartment and seal the deal.
Put a little kosher stamp on it, and you're good to go.
My mother accepted my wife when we had my first child. And interestingly, her only question was, will he have a circumcision? She didn't ask this religious one, because she knew I was not at all just in religion then.